the metric we get from government of harming resistance and harming decolonization is way too general for it to be an actual metric that we use to apply it to a large sentencing thing, right? Like you are applying the sentencing of war criminal punishment. I think that requires a certain degree of specificity and in recognition of the severity of the crimes caused by the individuals. I think what you get on the other side is dilution of those things. A few points of setup. Firstly, we support things like state acknowledgement of ownership and ownership of the blame of these things. So the colonial state will have to acknowledge these things and like either act in ways by giving reparations or like anti-colonial state laws by like undoing all the bad things they've done. I think the example of this was Germany actively like using anti-Nazi systems to erode the trust in the Nazi regime and recognizing that they did harm through their colonial systems. I think a lot of states do this already. We're also okay with normal trying, right? As normal criminals in accordance with the normal laws that are in the state. So if a person did commit the direct harms that they give to us on government side, then they would be tried in the normal way and their violence would be punished. Therefore, I think we mitigate a large part of the things that they come from government side. We also, what is the comparative on our side? I think we support alternative ways to call out bad views from scholars, right? We support activists speaking out, we support other academicians debunking those theories, and we think those alternatives are way better than the alternatives we get, which is just labeling them as war criminals. Because look at their own rhetoric. They say that they want to restore trust in intellectual institutions and intellectual domains, right? But I think the way you do that on their side, the moment you label one academician as a war criminal, you immediately erode all trust in the entire academic field. Because people are incentivized to overgeneralize that in the entire academic field, in of itself, are war criminals and are actively evil and bad, right? And this happens all the time with populist politician rhetoric, which is especially more volatile in these nations because they're post-colonial. They're don't have a strong ideology to stand on. I think you end up like radicalizing people to hate on all types of academicians, which just decreases the academic quality of these nations. I think from the outset, then our comparative is better because when other academicians are able to point to the fact that these academicians are bad and those academicians are wrong, then you also increase trust in academicians as a whole because then you are able to point to those success cases or those people who are actually doing good and are actually espousing good rhetoric. I also think on framing here, this is important, right? There will still be sympathizers of these scholars or local scholars on both sides. The delta in this debate is in which side are those scholars better dealt with and are those sympathizers better dealt with. I think the comparative on your side is worse. You will radicalize them. These scholars will play the victim card that they've been given a disproportionate punishing and response by the state. And these sympathizers often feel like those scholars haven't done the worst forms of harm, right? Because look at what they are justifying. They're not justifying violence, they're not justifying death, they're justifying the small things the state has done, like giving medicine and all those things. While those things may be wrong, the average sympathizer will not be able to understand that, given that you don't even support other academicians calling this out. You just give a blanket label on these people. We think there's a bad comparative. We think what will happen is that even if you crack down on these people, they will just go underground. It's much harder to openly engage with the problems. You'll have a cesspool of people like spreading pro-colonialist views underground, and I think that causes a lot of problems for the nation. First argument then on how this doesn't meet the criteria of being a war crime. I think there are two criteria here, right? One, criminal effect, and two, criminal intent. On criminal effect, I think this was never the direct cause or harm done by colonialism. This never resulted in direct violence. This might have contributed to certain people believing in certain things, but the direct violence was always caused by a general or by the state agreeing to certain policies and all of that, right? So should a soldier or a police officer be tried, then I don't think we do this already, right? We allow these people to go free because we recognize that they've been acting on no thank you on orders given by someone else and on orders given by the state. And we know that these individuals were not complicit in doing those things. Therefore, we don't try them as war criminals, even though those individuals committed direct violence and they were oftentimes the machinery of the state to commit those violence. They say on government that these individuals were platformed and helped by the colonial regimes. I think this is more of a reason why these individuals don't deserve the war criminal punishing, right? Because like these people were instrumentalized by the state. Did they really have another choice? If they knew the other choice was probably the state sending them to jail, I think in our crime right now, we are able to evaluate that certain individuals aren't able to make choices in these circumstances. Therefore, we don't punish these individuals further because that would be a form of double punishment, and we don't do that to certain individuals, right? I think also here the degree of damage that is caused by these individuals is not really the biggest degree of damage. You were a small community to begin with. Like there were probably more propaganda ministers within the state that were pushing you like this rhetoric out. The local intellectuals or artists were never a big force to begin with. You would also have acted with or without you. So even if you didn't push all this stuff, the state would have probably still committed violence. The people on the ground would have probably still committed violence against the locals. I don't think you necessarily were the main cause of it. They have to prove that burden, and you didn't create a tipping point, right? They say that these people have influence, but this happens on a scale, right? There are small people, there are small artists and small academicians that will get punished on your side, even though they did small things, and they were probably forced to do those things. And sure, while the big ones do exist on like either side as well, I don't think those individuals deserve the form of punishment that you're willing to give out to them. I think that results in dilution. Secondly, then on criminal intent, I think crime is only a crime if you have bad intentions of doing it to begin with, but you wanted to kill people, like in a crime of, like, we don't trial people for crimes of passion or crimes of insanity, or we allow insanity pleas, because you recognize these people didn't want to do these things, they acted in a passionate fit of rage or something like that. So I think you as an intellectual highlighted the positive effects it could bring to you as a society. That means you wanted to help the locals within society, so you highlighted the positive effects the regime could bring to society. Even though this is probably untrue, it's still a depiction of the intent of these people, and I don't think that crime counts as a bad intent or an intent to commit violence towards these people. These people are also probably benefited, right? They believe, since they were benefited, that other people should be benefited. While this might be irrational, you could definitely make the legal case that they were acting on what limited knowledge was available to them. These colonial regimes often have the incentive to limit certain things and to make certain things good. If I move on, I'll take you, right?
Would you also try these people for non-war crime offenses like sedition or treason, which do not require direct violence?
If there are laws in the state that have been agreed upon to try these people, we will not try them as war criminals, we will try them as normal criminals, as long as there are laws in the state that have these certain things, right? Second argument then on how you said a bad person. I think one, you dilute the war criminal label, right? Why will dilution happen? One, colonial sympathizers will still try to justify these people and paint the sentencing as something that is disproportionate. Secondly, the average person intuitively believes that these people are not as bad as the murderers, as the generals that do all these bad crimes. And thirdly, the direct murder warrants, like direct murder and violence committed by the state, warrants a different degree of severity and scrutiny that we are giving towards those generals, right? So I think when dilution happens, the war criminal label itself is diluted. There's no way a murderer who has actively committed violence by organizing the death of thousands of people in camps and all those things should deserve the same sentencing as a scholar that only menially contributed towards that certain thing. I think what this happens and is implicitly lowering of the sentencing of the murderer on your side. Therefore, justice is not preserved on side government. You make it a lower standard, and criminal sentencing is given out less, or is given less of an impact to it, which means every iteration of it will be less powerful, since even a scholar can get that form of sentencing, right? I think also secondly, you stigmatize and over scrutinize academicians. Your response is not proportionate. Academicians are likely to feel scared and to explore certain topics because they will view it as an overreach, since the state actively punish all forms of academicians, even the small ones, even the big ones, for what they did in these states. I think that restricts academic freedom, and insofar as we as a society enshrine those things and enshrine the ability for academicians to explore certain things as long as it's logical, I think you have that on your side, because academicians no way are able to internalize that this is only applicable to a certain scenario. For all those reasons, vote OO.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving on to Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
First, I want to clarify why these individuals need to be prosecuted for war crimes rather than crimes in general. There are three reasons why. One, because sedition prosecution on existing laws in the books cannot actually work at prosecuting them. Note, opening opposition isn't advocating passing a new law. Their argument is if they violated existing sedition laws, they will be prosecuted. The problem is, in common law, which is common law jurisdictions are the overwhelming emergence of colonialism, you are not engaging in sedition against an existing state. You are engaging in speech that incites or abets war crimes prior to the establishment of the state. So there is no legal grounds to prosecute these individuals under sedition. Second, there is no legal grounds to prosecute them under treason either. Why? The distinction between treason and a war crime is that war crime is a crime against the enemy, while treason is a crime against the side that you are fighting on behalf of. So the same acts of speech in existing war crime law, when perpetrated against the enemy, aren't acts of treason, and therefore there is no legal grounds to prosecute them for treason. And third, I'm going to establish that the specific crimes that you were aiding and abetting, where you were aiding and abetting war crimes, which creates a moral obligation to prosecute them for war crimes. Additionally, opening opposition agrees that most of these people aren't being prosecuted for any crimes. You know how I know that? One, their own arguments on these individuals being potentially innocent and thus not deserving prosecution. Two, their own arguments on creating a chilling effect on academic speech is a concession from opening opposition, that opening opposition is not going to pursue prosecution of them through other means. So any attempts from closing half to try to argue that war crime prosecution specifically is necessary cannot work in this debate. Second, let's talk about justice. Couple of questions under justice. Question one, are these individuals culpable? Their first claim is that local individuals are being coerced by the colonial regime. One, if you prove coercion, it's probably an effective defense in court on our side of the house for three reasons. One, we have the fiat to do so. Two, it is likely to happen because post-colonial states generally adopt common law. Third, if there are innocent intellectuals who are willing to change their minds and start repudiating colonialism after the fact, the state will benefit from their intellectual speech in the decolonization process and thus has incentives to not prosecute them. But second, there were many individuals who engaged in the speech without facing coercion from colonialism. Sure, they were supported by colonizers, but there are strong reasons to think colonizers didn't coerce local intellectuals to speak out in their favor. One, because instances of coercion becoming public reduces the credibility of local intellectuals. Colonizers have a ton of their own French and British intellectuals engaging in pro-colonial speech. The reason they prop up local intellectuals specifically is because they have credibility with the general public and are viewed as representatives of locals. This view completely shakes apart if there's even one case or one scandal that is uncovered of an individual being coerced by a colonizer. So if this coercion happens, the whole point, the whole credibility of the colonizer breaks down. Second, because colonial intellectuals themselves often believed in academic freedom. For example, colonial universities produced intellectuals that encouraged free thought. Critically, the ability to sponsor them through positive incentives, for example, funding them to engage in such speech, removes the need for you to engage in explicit coercion. And we see empirical examples of this. For example, Samuel Seabury during the US resistance process was a bishop who spoke in favor of colonizers despite not facing any coercion. So innocents aren't being prosecuted. Their second claim is about intent. They're like, well, you had good intention for the society, therefore you shouldn't be prosecuted. But there is a difference between actus reus, i.e. having intent, and doing the crime because you think it's good for society. Many people do crimes because they think it's good for society and are still prosecuted. Like lots of people who are committing hate crimes against gay people think gay people are bad for society. They're doing what is good for the religion. They're still going to be prosecuted. Thinking it is good for society is never a sufficient bar for you to not be prosecuted for a crime. Question two, did they cause violence? Opening opposition argues they were never a tipping point for violence. They often were. One, because local people often joined pro-colonial movements because they were students of these intellectuals. For example, in India, they became sepoy soldiers under the British regime or became intellectual contributors to the British bureaucracy because they were individuals whom they looked up to, and the education system engages in propaganda to convince them that people like professors are really important for them. Second, their intellectual work was critical to convince intellectuals in colonized periods. Lots of British intellectuals were uncomfortable with the prospect of British colonialism, but got convinced by arguments like they were engaging in the civilizing of brutes, and specifically having local intellectuals was critical because it told them, look, even the Indians whom I respect, even the Pakistanis who are intelligent, even the Ghanaians who are smart are engaging in discourse that tells us that colonialism is necessary for the civilization of these places, which encourages the political capital and financing of colonial endeavors. Third, they argue you can get justice through other means like reparations. One, it doesn't solve this problem of justice, and two, colonial states have to choose to give reparations. Britain never did. This argument matters because utilitarianism is false. Interpersonal comparisons of utility are impossible or inherently extremely difficult, and utilitarianism does not capture a fundamental element of human dignity. We believe in punishing people who aid and abet war crimes, regardless of whether it leads to good social outcomes. If someone engages in a murder, you'll never let them off just because it leads to bad social outcomes. You have a moral obligation to prosecute them. Second, I want to talk about funding and support for academia. The starting point of this argument is that any impacts in this debate about what happens before decolonization are substantially harder to make confident claims about. And this beats their argument that this creates a chilling effect on academics. Look, before decolonization happened, in order for you to be deterred by the possibility of future prosecution, you'd have to believe that the anti-colonial movement wins. But if you believe the anti-colonial movement wins, you're probably not going to engage in anti-colonial speech anyway, because you worry that your speech will not give you a powerful position in the future. Therefore, you are not preemptively deterred because you don't believe the anti-colonial movement will win. But second, this motion is in the present tense. There aren't a ton of states engaged that are currently colonized. As a consequence, this impact is necessarily smaller than potential impacts of what happens in the post-colonial state itself. Now, we acknowledge that people aren't actually going to buy the views of these pro-colonial academics. However, these intellectuals will continue to have prominent presences in ops world. One, because they will build strong domestic audiences because their names were previously associated with trust and recognition. Two, they will get disproportionate attention because their views remain outside the mainstream, and controversial views get more engagement and more attention, so they are disproportionately platformed by things like media platforms. And third, they often retain funding from colonizers after the fact, which beats their claim that you can have critical views from academics platformed as much so trust in academics goes up. No, they simply won't get as much attention. And this is why our argument flips their claim on populists. Because if you view these institutions as representative of academia, because they are the academics who get the most media attention, because they are propped up by current academic institutions, that is when populist rhetoric against academia becomes powerful, and when populists view intellectual establishments as a threat to their success, causing the firing of technocrats and the defunding of universities that are necessary in these post-colonial states, the largest impact in this debate. Propose.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving on to Deputy Leader of Opposition to close up the opening exchange. Here.
All right, give me a few seconds to set up my timer. I think the problem with OG is that they don't actually engage in how this plays out in reality. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum. A few strategic observations before I move on to two clashes. Firstly, whether or not this is justified, and secondly, on which side helps the country move on and be better in the future. So a few observations. I think firstly, it's speculative whether or not colonialists are 100% bad to a country or whether they did some good. So I think insofar as this is true, I think we ought to prioritize people spreading their beliefs and spreading their thoughts. I think on our side, we won't criminalize their teachings and their free speech. We won't criminalize these scholars and artists just for teaching people what they believe in. But if they did directly cause harmful actions, if they like themselves killed a group of people, I think that would fall under the normal parameters in which the justice system steps in. So the upshot is basically we should not ever punish someone for their beliefs and their thoughts. I think secondly, I don't think OG can cop out and says if it's positive speech, actually the state won't punish them. Because where do you draw the line? How can you be if their whole case is correct, how can you be sure that this didn't lead to all of the harms that they talk about? But lastly, if there really is a widespread anger against colonialism, like OG characterizes, then I think these intellectuals won't have much effect to these people, right? And their work isn't going to be accepted by the people that really, really hate the colonialists. So I think the ones that are going to buy the research and the ones that are going to buy the justifications are the people on the fence. And therefore, I think it's justified that these people believe in the teachings of these scholars, believe in the teachings of these artists, and therefore it's justified. I think other responses are going to be integrated. So first question, is this justified? I think OG gave us a few mechanisms, and I'll take them down. I think firstly, they tell us that it leads to a decreased willingness to participate in the resistance. I don't really see why this is bad, because if these people believe that colonialism is better for their country, why is it bad that they express these beliefs, and why is it bad that they believe that they shouldn't participate in the resistance? I think these are beliefs that people have, and these are beliefs that they should be allowed to act upon. But secondly, they tell us that now the scholars' works and the teachings will drown out anti-colonial work. I think these scholars probably are not funded by colonialists because these scholars want to appeal to people, right? They want to be seen as an independent body that still thinks colonialism is justified and they think that it's still okay. So they don't want to be seen as part of the movement and be seen as biased, and therefore they won't accept the funding from these colonialists. But even if they are funded by colonialists, I don't think it really matters because it isn't objectively bad that these people just spread their beliefs. So what then does this intellectual work actually look like? I'm going to give you concrete characterization right here. I think the firstly, the justification and the teachings we get from these scholars is probably going to be somewhat logical and somewhat rational. Because if it wasn't, nobody would want to believe in, right? Because how can you say that all locals deserve to die and burn out, right? Because so therefore the justifications are probably going to be logical and able to be accepted by society. So they can't say that it was good that the colonialists killed the locals and that's why we should support the colonialists. So they have to do things that make sense. If not, they won't get any scholars and they won't get any supporters. What they do is they'll probably point out the ways in which the colonialists have helped out the country, the ways in which certain policies have benefited people, and the ways in which these policies were so much better than the current than any potential future government. So this is unjustified. You trying these people as war criminals is unjustified because even if the scholars weren't coerced, it's still their innate beliefs and it's something that they believe, right? So they didn't want to explicitly cause harm and lead people to their death. They're just spreading their own beliefs. So obviously they won't say and they won't tell their supporters that all locals should die and burn and that you should kill all of the locals. They'll probably point out the ways in which colonialism helped out the country. But if this leads to a group of people collectivizing and murdering people, the fault isn't going to be on the scholar. It's on these individuals that actually committed the harm, and these people will get charged anyway because this would fall under the normal parameters in society. I think an intuition problem is that you don't jail someone if they just like teach a class on why Nazis weren't all that bad in society. But I want to add a new mechanism under here. I think absent of these intellectuals actually speaking up, it's the state and incumbent government will just spread their own propaganda after in the post-colonial state, right? I think these intellectuals speaking up is a good countervailing force. I think this is diametrically opposed to the state spreading hate and propaganda on the colonizers, and this is just inherently bad because it's probably lies and it's highly exaggerated. I think on our side, our comparative was we were better able to actually increase discourse, to actually have more conversations. So we will have the scholars that support colonialists and the scholars that don't support colonialists. And these are the discourse that we can secure on our side of the house. We can increase the information provided to people. We can let people choose for themselves what they want to think and what they want to believe. And I think this is quite intuitive, right? Because these people have the incentive to capitalize on the post-colonial vigor and to also aid the resistance movement if they want to. And they feel an obligation to it because they realize that it's the most proximate concern. And this is important in this debate for a few reasons. I think firstly, we already win on scale because we're better able to secure the right and the ability for people to actually speak up. We allow them to express their own beliefs, even if it is potentially objectively wrong. Because how do you determine like what belief is objectively right and objectively wrong? I think only
You're
through
right.
more discourse and more conversations is how we get closer to that. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
From who?
Do you think states have existing laws which allow them to retroactively prosecute crimes which allow colonialism to happen?
I think we aren't gonna prosecute these scholars because they didn't actively commit a harm. So the people that did commit a harm, the people that actually like held the guns and committed those violence will already be prosecuted under the normal parameters in which the justice system exists and under the laws in which that like you don't let criminals and people that murder people go free, right? So next question, which side helps the country move on? I think on your side, you actually create a more polarized society and you make it even more unstable because people on the ground obviously don't agree with this for a few reasons. I think firstly, the supporters of these artists and scholars become more radicalized. They double down because they feel like these trials are witch hunts and they are politically motivated actions rather than actual fair justice. This just means that it leads to a loss of trust in the legal system and government institutions, and the ideals are still going to be spread by the supporters. But secondly, other individuals, like on the ground, even if they aren't supporters of these scholars, they are still going to riot and protest because what's next? It's a slippery slope and a chilling effect. Because what else is the state going to do? Are they going to crack down on like future political dissidents? Because this would also lead to violence and it would also ruin the stability of the government. So they're scared that whatever they also like express and whatever they say will also lead to the same thing and will also lead to them being like charged and punished or whatever. But I also want to flip their funding and support for academia. Because we told you when you actually paint them as war criminals, you send a signaling effect that from everyone from that university, everyone from that institution is illegitimate and their views are wrong. So you cast the same shadow on everyone else. But our comparative was so much better. When you only try the worst people as war criminals, the actual people that committed the violence and the atrocities, you were better able to actually unite society because you're better able to create a consensus. This behavior is the only one that is unacceptable, and this behavior was the only one that was truly harmful to their nation. So I think even then we went on their metric for all those reasons. Oh.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving on to government member to start the closing debate. Here.
Hey, just checking I can be heard.
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
problem with opening half is that it's deeply uncomparative. Opening opposition describes something which looks nothing at all like a war crime trial, and opening government refuses to acknowledge that there are alternative means of prosecuting these persons. So we are first of all going to explain why it is the case that the laws actually work on our side and can achieve opening government's benefits in a way they never do. And secondly, explain why on the question of justice, it is inside opening opposition where you are likely to get over prosecution, but moreover, why you're able to effectively ensure justice is achieved far more effectively on our side. First of all, to establish the context where this debate occurs, we agree with opening opposition. There are probably two contexts where this might happen. First, it's in states that crack down too aggressively on these kind of academics, etc. That is because, as opening opposition describes, these states may be populist, they have incentives to crack down on any possible dissenters, and often wants to over-regulate the kind of dissent that academics make against their current regime. Secondly, though, there may be states where people are too sympathetic to the process of colonialism. Maybe some people do believe it wasn't as bad as it was and might be still willing to listen to these academics. We would point out these contexts are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, in many states, there may be some people who are colonist sympathizers, and there may be states who are overly aggressive. But we're going to explain why in each of these different contexts, it is the case you are able to get more justice and more effective regulation of the harms of colonization. First of all, why is it the case that in the counterfactual, where there is likely to be laws which already regulate and prosecute these individuals like opening opposition says there will be, it is just the case that these laws are likely to be ineffective at preventing the harms of colonization? Opening opposition says that these other laws are sufficient, and they give a set of structural reasons for it. These governments obviously want to crack down. They can write laws which have retrospective effect, as we point out in a POI that is the empirical truth of the vast majority of cases, which even if you're unsure which is true, you could probably turn to. And it's likely already done, given that this is probably what happens in the decolonization process. And opening government only asserts in response, well, that these laws never work, but don't really provide the structural reason this is true. So we're going to assume you believe opening opposition, which is empirical reality, that most states already have laws to prosecute those who are involved in colonialism. The question, therefore, though, is why are these laws insufficient to achieve all of opening government's benefits on discrediting these people when you try them for treason or sedition? We're going to explain it in two ways. The first reason that alternative laws like treason are insufficient is because, as opening opposition points out, a set of people are liable to believe these trials are fake and therefore still listen to these intellectuals. We observe that when you trial someone for war crimes, however, one, these trials are stricter. That is that you require a far greater amount of evidence to show their failure and to show their liability under war crimes. Things like actually inciting people to do violence, which everyone would believe is morally evil, as opposed to perhaps merely opposing a state which some people at the time did believe was necessarily harmful. We'll point out as well that often trials are necessary to reveal this evidence. So if you don't prosecute someone for war crimes, the information and facts which show that they were guilty of that offense would never come to the surface, because they are often hidden behind people's own control, which you can't acquire otherwise. But second of all, we would point out that war crime trials are standardized to a far greater extent. And that is because war crimes is an offense which is defined in international law by the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court. And even if you don't believe that these states will remit these cases to the International Criminal Court, which they probably won't, almost every state in the world has adopted into their domestic laws the way that you have to prosecute war crimes and what that crime is defined by, which just explains that not only is this law in fact more fair, but it's demonstrably more fair, because you're more likely to turn to the support of international law who's able to do things like make sure these individuals have a fair trial, etc. Which just explains, if the problem is getting people to believe these convictions, obviously, when you not only compel the evidence which is able to then go into the news and show the guilt of these people, but also when you do it under a standard that not only your people, but the international community believes in, you're likely to get a far more effective discrediting of these academics. Secondly, though, we would explain that the specific harms and struggles of pointing out the failures of colonization is that people will tend to believe that colonization has uplifted this populace, and that's what opening opposition says these academics often argue for. We would explain that when you trial someone for something like treason or sedition, that they were merely helping a colonial process, this is not enough, because people think that colonial process was necessary. They imagine an upheaval of a state which they are taught to believe was in fact insufficient and was in fact archaic, when instead you are able to draw attention uniquely in a war crime trial to the violence, to the harms that are occurring in that area, not merely disloyalty to the state, which is why if people are dubious as to whether these academics are evil, it is only through war crimes when you draw attention to the violence and you make that the central aspect, when the title of war crimes is there, that people are likely to believe it. Before I go on to deal with over-prosecution and justice, POI from opening.
Yeah, why isn't the comparative of other academicians calling these people out and debunking the things naturally not enough to like erase anti-resistance rhetoric?
Well, it might be, but that's only a response to opening government, not us, because we are explaining why in some cases where it won't be and both teams are insufficient and you need to turn to treason on your side, that would not have been enough and we're proving the marginal benefit. The second thing I'm going to explain, though, is why you're likely to engage in over-prosecution. And this obviously proves the harm why, well, this is actually the explanation for why, even if you could call out academics, you do it too much and there's a harm. We would explain that opening half talks about the principle of justice. However, we would explain that laws are far better at enforcing justice than debaters, who in this room do not have access to the facts, who do not have access to fair trials and the right for people to defend themselves, and would intend supposedly to apply a blanket law that you could never ever trial someone for war crimes, even if a court would find they did. And we would suggest we will prove structurally why courts are likely to be good at this. But also, we would explain that when you subject people to a fair trial, that is the only way to ensure that justice is done, because you obviously need to deal with things on a case-by-case basis. Maybe some academics did commit more crimes, maybe some didn't. We would suggest it's only on-side government where you're able to prosecute those people correctly. First of all, what do opposition's laws look like? We would explain these are laws which are designed to get prosecutions, because politicians want wins. It looks like you are changing and it looks like you are fixing the damages done over colonialization. But also you want laws which are easy to use. You can use it to protect your own power, given that they prove these academics are likely to be dissenters against the government, which just suggests the kind of laws which apply to retrospectively deal with colonization on upside often don't require things like demonstration of, don't require things like a defense of necessity, often don't need you to actually prove that you've done significant harm, merely maybe that you opposed what is generally the government force now. We would explain that this is the active harm of injustice, because often these laws are made retrospectively and are made to prosecute everybody and give them no chance to defend themselves. So we would explain that we can fix this insofar as we at least stop people from being prosecuted in these laws, because people are only able to be prosecuted for one offense, is either war crimes or treason. So when you prosecute it for war crimes, you stop the active harm. We would explain there is a benefit, because as I explained before, the way that you prosecute war crimes is fixed by an international standard. There is high burdens. It is out of control. You're likely to attract the scrutiny not only of your local population, but of international law scholars from around the world who know how war crime trials work and who have an invested incentive to ensure this trial does well, which proves the structure which is necessary for opening government, who asserts that maybe sometimes these people should be guilty of war crimes, but never explains why you can find those people guilty or why you won't find other people guilty. We would suggest that an effective system of law is the only way to ensure that justice is done. Opening opposition can't prove it's effective on their side. Opening government can't prove it's effective on our side. That is only done by closing government.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving on to opposition member here.
Hi, can I check that I'm both audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Side closing opposition will launch two forms of attack on the pragmatics. One, why it is likely that you harm the intellectual population of the post-colonial state, which is harmful then to the future progress. And secondly, also why an overemphasis of colonial trauma results in long-term harm towards these nations. But before that, to deal with the with the arguments on principles and justice, I just don't think it's that important. The first thing I want to talk about there on responses is that I don't really think that the discussion of post-colonial public places and perceptions that opening argues is that important in the first place for two reasons. One, I think that these states are already incredibly authoritarian. Look at Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, all of these countries were led by authoritarian states with like monopoly on force, etc., that already had these justice systems in the first place. Meaning then that on our side of the house, it's entirely possible that you do things like stamp out pro-colonial speech in your country in the post-colonial states, but also secondly, that you pressure them to withdraw their statements in the first place, which then suggests they don't actually get any of the harms. But secondly also, is that the post-colonial state has high anti-colonial sentiment anyways, limiting the effects of these people's speech even if they have some kind of continue to publish academia anyways. This is not knifing or opening, but not knifing or opening, but it's simply analysis on what the most realistic depiction of these post-colonial academic spaces are likely to look like in the first place. Maybe Orwell's world exists in certain instances where this influence is small, but I just don't think that's a majority of the cases of these post-colonial states. But secondly, I want to just respond to CG on this argument on justice. I'm going to prove later why it's not that important and logically prior to the pragmatics, but there are three broad responses I want to make. Firstly, I would say that the existing legal structures in post-colonial states were incredibly undeveloped in the first place, so they're unlikely to be rigorously tried, especially because you are a new and fresh independent state with underdeveloped systems. But secondly, also, because of the fact their own arguments suggest that these governments need to show performance legitimacy, it then is likely to be the case that they use these trials to skew the courts and establish national unity, and they're more likely than not, these people are more likely than not to get prosecuted anyway, so I don't think this is particularly asymmetrical on either side of the house, insofar as the governments continue to create and enforce the laws and have control over the ways in which courts progress. So it's unclear why, even if you get their kinds of international standards applied, these things won't be skewed anyways. But lastly, also, it is that public sentiment at the point in which they are tracked publicly is likely to be incredibly negative because of the nature of post-colonial states, which which are likely to have some form of hatred towards the colonial masters, which then suggests that the court and juries are really skewed against people, which then necessarily means that on their side of the house, they can never actually get a fair trial anyways, justice isn't served. Necessarily also then, why are these people not war criminals? Because to meet the bar of burden of proof, there's incredibly high burden of proof that needs to be met. I think there are a couple of reasons. One, they're often forced to do it. These people are often forced to do it because they're under duress insofar as colonial masters kept a tough watch on these intellectuals and threatened them with things like killing them or their family if they did not comply, because there's likely been the case given the other slew of messed up things they did, for example, strip people's property in this states. But also secondly, that these people were themselves indoctrinated by the state and access to skewed information, meaning then that this idea of the mens rea or criminal mind and intention is never actually proved on their side of the house either, which necessarily suggests that under their skewed justice systems, these people are likely to be unjustly prosecuted and do not actually meet the burden of proof of proving that they are actually war criminals in the first place, insofar as they were innocent individuals that simply acted as a result of duress. First argument, therefore, on why it harms the intellectual population of the post-colonial state. We think that it's likely to be the case that a majority of intellectuals within the states had to use these kinds of narratives within their work for four structural reasons. One, in terms of self-preservation, at the most baseline and extreme level, they're often facing the threat of death or torture from the colonial masters if they did not comply. But secondly, also, that in terms of that, even if it's to a lesser degree, things like not having their works published or being fired from their positions because colonial masters have such a high grip on the space, because there are incentive structures of colonials to manipulate academia because they saw it as a strong medium by which they could exert control over the state, necessarily suggests they're also forced to do it for their own sake. But lastly also, that they were indoctrinated by the state as they themselves were pupils of colonial intellectuals who fed them these narratives glorifying colonial masters. But also lastly, the access to information was incredibly skewed, meaning that the period of incredibly weak accountability mechanisms in the pre-colonial times in academia was dominated by colonial masters. The conclusion of this, therefore, is that if they do try individuals, a lot of people will be affected and a lot of intellectuals will be affected. The impact of imprisoning such a vast network of intellectuals, therefore, is one, they do not get intellectual progress and support in crucial areas of things like the economy, architecture, things like social sciences, because the vast majority prison for life. But secondly, also, for those who did not get caught, they move out because they create an environment of fear in the intellectual space where they see all their other counterparts getting arrested as well. But also lastly, they also locks up intellectuals from these colonial states from entering, things like professors, architects, and analysts, which are crucially important to enter into your state and help you out in the progress of development. There are three structural reasons why this is the most important argument in this debate under Garth Bench, operating under Garth Bench metric of future progress. The first reason is that post-colonial states are also post-conflict states, driven with ethnic fault lines, and they are incredibly fractured, which then suggests that strong governance and politicians to unite and have good leadership is incredibly important. Look at the example of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, which united the state and caused the state to be able to flourish under his governance. But secondly, also, that tangibly speaking, development of social and geographical planning also requires incredible amounts of expertise, which then suggests that you need these kind of people to be dominant within your spaces. But lastly, also, the long-term benefits of building up a culture of academic excellence that also compounds into future benefits, insofar as you're able to become into the future a forefront of a particular area of study, or even having less reliance on intellectual inflow from other kinds of countries. So the way up then from OG in terms of moral obligations is that the obligation to future generations is far more important, which is basically crucial for their standard of living insofar as to keep these people unprosecuted compared to the reparative functions, because the harm has already been done to a limited number of people compared to the vast number of people into the future. The counterfactual, therefore, is that intellectuals on the other side of the house are unlikely going to continue supporting colonial masters, and because they are no longer under the threat of colonial powers anyways, meaning that they are unlikely to have to spread pro-colonial narratives in a post-colonial state. Before I move on to my second argument, it is PY from opening.
15 seconds. OO's explicit counterprop is not prosecuting most of these intellectuals because OO's own arguments on allowing speech are reasons why they don't support these prosecutions. If you trial a single academic, you don't tarnish the rest of academia that criticizes them, but if you don't prosecute them, these academics get disproportionate attention, leading to popular sentiment against intellectuals. That also flips your claim on getting intellectuals into the government to allow the post-colonial transition.
No, I think the idea of like being able to hide a lot of these things already exists anyway. So insofar as you do not prosecute them, you keep them away from the public eye, people are still quite happy. Last argument, therefore, on why you overemphasize on colonial trauma and why that harms these nations. One, you enshrine authoritarian leaders. The reason for this is that you set up certain groups of people as traitors, which then galvanizes support for the government through the excuse of retribution. It looks like things like the formations of cults of personality around these authoritarian figures through identity politics, which enshrines their power as right and control what ideologies are correct and what isn't. But secondly, also, you stymie national progress because a lot of the key components of success for these states come from colonial powers due to inexperience of local governments. Means that things like the constitution of law, things like governmental systems and structures, all of it are harmed on your side of the house insofar as you lock them out from accessing your country. Things that then therefore suggest that national progress is then harmed through laboring local intellectuals as war criminals as it sets out the citizens of a country are less important than things like cleansing colonial evil, which then sets a national direction of complete separation of colonial powers, which is bad for you economically and bad for you socially as a state. All of these reasons oppose.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving to Government Whip to close the government case. Here.
Can I be heard clearly?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, I'm going to explain why justice is a debate-winning contribution. First, why is justice actually a matter in this debate? Because you might believe OG and believe there are a set of instances where perhaps O and Sia agree that they do not trial. But you all also believe, first, we provide a set of structural reasons why there are a set of states who empirically will go to trial. In fact, you should believe this because they do prosecute former presidents, former policemen, former people. This suggests the laws exist for prosecution. So this isn't a knife. It's explained that there's a set of circumstances which are far more likely to happen under the world of closing government versus opening government, which opening opposition and closing opposition still fear into the debate. That is why justice is a question in this debate. Why is justice the most debate-winning question in this debate? But it collapses any question of academic trust, because every team in this debate asks the question, which side trusts academic more? But the question they never overcome is, how does the public react when they believe that these trials have been conducted improperly? Or how does the public react when they believe that the academics have been over-prosecuted? This is a question which no team besides closing government explains, and it's key to resolving this question for every other team in 3 key explanations. First, it defeats opening government, because opening government only provides an explanation of why on opening opposition's world, trust decreases, but we provide a higher burden and explain why trust actively increases on our side of the world for 3 key reasons. First, we explain that trust improves because when there is the perception that the trial has been conducted far better, they are far more likely thus to trust academics, and the chilling effect which opening opposition refers to does not happen. But second, it resolves the clash in opening government, because opening government unsuccessfully makes the trade-off that we might over-prosecute individuals, but that's fine. But we explain why you actually won't. We explain why the trials will be conducted well, which means you don't get in the chilling effect, because academics know they haven't done anything wrong and know they can trust a court system which relies upon international laws. They are therefore far more likely to actually result in good outcomes. But furthermore, we beat both opposition teams because we explain very clearly that there's excess prosecution on their side. Because the push we get, and the claim we make at member is we explain why there's over prosecution when it is done by your internal party, and the rhetoric from closing opposition reinforces this. Like, the response to that extension on justice is first saying they concede that these countries are underdeveloped. This plays into our extension, because our extension explains that if it is true that closing opposition is correct and their laws are underdeveloped, this explains why they rely upon international laws rather than trying to form their own internal laws. And even if it's not purely international law, we clearly explain that a lot of countries at least utilize it as a basis for it, which explains why the justice is so much better. The second response to closing opposition again concedes this, because they say public sentiment is negative. This perfectly explains why treason trials fail on side opposition and closing opposition and cause the chilling effect. Because when public sentiment is negative, you over-prosecute individuals. Every single individual who spoke against for colonialism is viewed as a war criminal, a treason, and therefore they are trialed on side opposition and closing opposition. This flips the harm, because this perfectly explains why there's over-prosecution and actually explains therefore why the chilling effect is so much worse under closing opposition. This very clearly explains therefore why we win on why justice is so important, because it unlocks the question which every other team seems to try and win in this debate regarding what is the academic impact. We unlock all the weighing mechanisms that opening government and opening opposition give. The final reason, however, that justice is important is because we explain that Oh, no, sorry, I already explained this. So this explains why justice is incredibly important. Now I'm going to go to the opening half and opening opposition first and explain why opening opposition is out of the debate. First, on opening opposition, what are their claims? They first say radicalization happens. And what they say here is that radicalization happens because individuals go underground. The first observation I'd like to make regarding this radicalization claim is it relies upon the premise that these individuals feel like they're being unjustly trialed and therefore go underground. But we overcome this because we explain why they don't get unjustly trialed. We in fact explain why they get very fairly trialed and therefore overcome the harms of radicalization. That said though, let's actually listen to their claims of radicalization. Why would an academic go underground when every team in this debate concedes that the only influence academics have is staying above the ground and actually having influence? Like, if they go underground, they can't radicalize anyone because they have a smaller community to go to, which significantly reduces the extent of this harm in the first place. Furthermore, however, we're going to flip this altogether because even if it is true that there is a small amount of radicalization under their side, we explain why trust in academia is just so much higher on our side, which is why individuals don't radicalize in the first place. Because if individuals perceive that the community and those around them view them as legitimate for the reasons of justice that we explain, this explains why there isn't chilling effect. This explains why they're not going to act in the ways that opening opposition suggests. The second claim is that it is unjust and therefore harmful. This is a really confusing claim which closing opposition is derivative of, and they try to say that because it is unjust, this is bad. First observation. It might be unjust in a set of instances, but this is why our extensions are really useful, because they explain why we are able to overcome this problem. Because if it is true that the system is unjust, they wouldn't be found guilty, because we explained that it is a fair trial process comparatively of unside compared to opening opposition, which explains therefore that justice and this claim is not as strong as they think it is. That said, what are the individual claims? They say it does not demonstrate criminal intent. I think the problem with this argument from opening opposition is I think that first, there is a trial to interrogate this, and we are the only team that explains why this trial works well. Second, we think that the process of this trial helps delegitimize this work, which is notably a unique contribution for closing government, which is independent of the success, no matter what responses or POIs you believe. Because even if it is true that, for example, this trial does not succeed, the fact that they are outed and trialed as a war criminal means that individuals are less likely to believe them in the first place, which means that the work that is harmful is not proposed in the first place. Closing opening opposition says bizarrely at the end of their case, oh, we should all prioritize freedom of speech. Why is it bad if you promote colonialism? Obviously, it's bad because you've allowed for the deaths of billions of individuals.
Yeah, we told you that the sympathizers would go underground, now recognizing that like the icons they idolize are getting prosecuted. Wouldn't that result in bubbles that foster like chambers in which people believe certain things but do not expose those things which foster hate underground?
Number one, we explain why you're over-prosecuted on your side, which is why they're more likely to go underground. Like, that is the extension. You haven't listened to the past few minutes of rebuttal I've been giving. Second claim that the final claim they make is about dilution. They say it's dilution because, you dilute other war criminals. Number one, you don't dilute war criminals because you have to find them guilty in the first place. And yes, maybe the process means you have more individuals, but these individuals are actually guilty. They have contributed to the deaths of many individuals. We don't think this is a claim that could win the debate. Finally, on opening government. Why do we beat opening government? First, I've explained why they don't meet the burden of trust. They merely explain why trust is worse on side alternative. We take the far higher burden and explain why it actually increases on our side. This is a bigger contribution because it actually increases the margin against both opposition teams and our government team. Second, they say that equivalent laws exist, but the problem with opening government is they only explain that there is a right to prosecute, but they never explain why it's done properly. We explain why this right is actually implemented while unlocking all of their practical benefits. Their final claim is on efficacy, but we would like to note that efficacy is so much better on our side when people trust in the criminal system and do believe that justice processes are fair. You should vote for the only team in this debate which actually explains how these trials work, why they're fair, and why you actually achieve justice to restore trust in academia.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now be moving on to opposition whip to close the debate. Here.
All right, just give me a quick moment. Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right. Okay. Pronunciation POIs by voice. I'll probably take one at 5. All right. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Within many post-colonial states lies many social divisions and fault lines that run rampant throughout society. And what uni especially isn't focused on pre-colonial and colonial trauma that tends to drag down these nations and their progress. What you need is the formation of a concrete national identity and progress that are able to provide the most tangible and proximate benefits to the individuals who have suffered far too long under colonial rule. I'm very proud to stand on CO. The entirety of opening plus CG contention and deadlock about the principle is fundamentally inconsistent and irrelevant due to the fact that all of them never actually focuses on what this debate was truly about, which was the idea of pragmatics. Why is this so? Joshua firstly already contests principle by telling you why it is likely that it's going to be unjust in the first place. The opening deadlock proves itself on intent and proves itself on harm. However, Joshua uniquely told you that one, the courts and juries are likely going to be skewed either way, and secondly, due to the need for performance legitimacy, the justification for unity, oftentimes these court proceedings are likely going to be skewed and going to cause immense amounts of injustice even under the conditions whereby these individuals are incredibly corrupt or are actually responsible for the spreading of colonial powers. But secondly, even under the context by which these individuals are innocent, they are put through scathing and problematic trials whereby they have to spend so much time to try and defend themselves, and after trial they have to suffer the add-on double punishment of public perception and public disgrace. Oftentimes this then leads to an incredible amount of harm done towards innocent intellectuals who have nothing to do with the discussion of these sorts of colonial powers. But thirdly, Joshua also told you, regardless of intent, which is what OO was stuck on this entire time, even if you were an intellectual that only wanted to pursue the most incredible pure intellectual means, you're likely then going to also suffer from these trials for the simple reason that you as an intellectual are likely going to promote colonialism in some way, shape or form if you want to have actual intellectual discussions and balanced discussions, due to the fact that one, all of the informations that are presented to you are essentially skewed by colonial powers, but secondly, you don't have epistemic access towards what true revisionist ideology is. That is to say, when you look at the historical interpretations of colonial powers, over time these forms of interpretation change due to the access and declassification of more forms of material. That is to say, innocent individuals are also likely going to be harmed, so it's unclear as to why the way up between innocent and not innocent stakeholders are likely going to justify the existence of these war crime trials in the first place. But secondly, we told you that the entirety of the debate that revolves around the justice is an irrelevant dynamic, as it assumes some form of objective justice that needs to be morally obligated and fulfilled. Yet at the point at which justice is ultimately for the purpose of catharsis and closure towards so many individuals who have suffered under colonial rule, which bases itself on utilitarian outcomes, we tell you that fairness isn't what's most important. It's the perception of fairness. It is the perception of fairness that's what's most important to everyone on the ground, because insofar as they're able to feel like justice has been achieved, then you're able to actually achieve the true purpose of justice, which is to give catharsis and closure to all the victims who have been harmed under the process of colonialism. Why is it so that we actually win on the main biggest crux of this debate, which is pragmatics? Then Joshua gave you 3 horizontal extensions within 3 clashes that crucially takes up vast majority of OO's argumentation, but also prudently proves why entirety of government bench don't actually garner any form of pragmatic outcomes. The first is intellectual discussion. I want to make it very clear. Opening clash is extremely deadlocky because it only focuses itself on trust. It focuses on whether individuals are likely going to trust or not. Notably, I think OO actually loses the interaction because their idea of lower trust is unresponsive to the frame that OG provides to you, which is that people already hate colonial masters. We agree with that frame, and that's the exact reason why we win this entire clash. Because one, under the situation by which individuals dislike colonial powers, it is then insane to posit that incentives to perpetuate post-colonial information is likely going to exist for this intellectual. Because under the context by which people dislike colonial powers, it is likely that intellectuals, one, get their funding under the government or under organizations within this certain government. Secondly, they are no longer under threat of colonial powers. But thirdly, they want to appeal to the individuals who already hate colonial powers, so they are likely then going to spread ideology or spread research and intellectual discussions that focuses on why colonial powers are bad and revise their own forms of ideology, meaning that the incentive to perpetuate colonial powers post-colonialism is likely going to be incredibly little. This already vastly takes out the vast majority of harms that OG provides in terms of harm towards decolonization. But secondly, just to quickly deal with CG, because they never actually dealt with us, they claim the entirety crux of their case was that war crime trials are simply much more believable, and that's why you're able to discredit these individuals and aid with the process of decolonization. The reason why this cannot be true is because it might be true to us, that is to say, as an objective observer within the realm of the debate in 2024, maybe it's likely you are going to believe that a war crime trial is likely going to be more objective and more fair. However, does this perception actually occur for the average citizen post-conflict? I don't actually think so, because these war crime trials, as they admit, exist within an international state run and created by Western powers. They are oftentimes the very perpetuators of colonialism in the first place. The hatred towards foreign influence and colonialism then leads to individuals not believing that these trials are actually fair, but a persecution and a form of persecution of intellectuals within local forms of within local countries, which then causes harm towards the country, but also a perpetuation of victory's history. That is to say, these individuals are trying to write their own forms of history through the intervention of foreign influence. Oftentimes, this then means trials actually look even more unjust towards the individuals within these countries in the first place, taking out the vast majority of CG's case. But lastly, we told you that under the context by which intellectuals continue to perpetuate colonial ideology and extend colonial power, it's likely that you're going to be able to stamp out all of these influences anyways. Joshua told you that the vast majority of post-colonial states are authoritarian, meaning that you're able to stamp out post-colonial speech and pressure them to withdraw the statement. But even under the context by which post-colonial states already have high anti-colonial sentiments, which OG agrees to, is then more likely that hegemonic media supports anti-colonial sentiments and then create cults of personality around these individuals, making it more likely that the support for against colonialism is very important. But secondly, we told you that even if you don't buy the ability for decolonization to actually happen to a farther degree, we told you that national progress need to occur independent of that. That is to say, you don't have intellectuals in the first place. Notice that CG doesn't actually engage with this argument, which crucially loses them this debate. We told you that intellectuals are unlikely going to exist because the vast majority of intellectuals are going to be trialed because of the 4 reasons that Joshua provided: that self-preservation, that there is restrictions of free speech, that there's indoctrination, that there's skewed information. This means that the vast majority of intellectuals are either going to be punished, or even if they are innocent and are not eventually punished, they are likely going to live within an environment of fear, so they want to move out and migrate away from these countries given the privileges that were afforded to them by colonial powers and the resources they have to do that. This often means that not only is it the case that intellectuals from foreign countries that are important don't actually enter your country, but also the case that the intellectual that you domestically have also leave, meaning that the most important stakeholder in this debate to allow for national progress to actually occur are absent within the structures of your own nation, within governance, within economy, within healthcare, within education. This generally means that you don't have any form of long-term independence that you're going to suffer. But lastly, he told you about national progress, which is the persecution of your own citizens as war criminals, as people against the country and helping the enemy, means that there is a overemphasis of cleansing colonial powers rather than protection of your own citizens. This generally means that national progress is now reliant on certain forms of indoctrination that colonial powers are bad. That means the formation of your national identity and the progress of your nation is likely not going to occur due to the fact it's premise of national hatred on colonial powers and you don't get assistance from these powers in the first place. Because we win the entirety of the pragmatics, that is to say, we prove to you that it's likely that intellectual discussion and intellectuals are going to exist in the first place and that national progress actually exists. We remove the shackles that have been holding these individuals down for far too long. I'm so incredibly proud to stand on CO.
Thank you for that speech. You may now cross the house. Congratulations, everyone. For my panelists, let's go to room 4.